Okay, so I'll kick off today's session. As you all know, we're here to discuss the 10-point plan, which is a paper published by UK government, which sets out an ambitious plan for green industrial revolution. Delivery of this plan is crucial for tackling the climate crisis, and it aims to create and support up to 250,000 green jobs in the UK. So yeah, as I said, the 10-point plan covers truly ambitious clean energy industries, as well as clean transport, nature restoration, and innovative technologies. So as you can imagine, this is a really exciting time for industries and cutting edge research. So without further ado, I'm delighted to introduce a number of guest speakers who will be talking with us today about their role in facilitating the 10-point plan and how the industries, and some information on these industries which are making a really key difference. So today, as you can see, we have Caterina, who's the head of climate policy at Green Alliance, Rishi, head of climate and sustainable finance at Natwest, and Alicia, delivery coordinator at OIC, the Offshore Wind Industry Council. So I believe Caterina will be going first today, so I'd like to welcome you to present to everyone today. Before we go on, I will just encourage people, if you have any questions, just pop them in the Q&A box, and we'll get to those at the end of the session, and try and answer as many of those as possible. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Juliet, and thanks for the invitation to speak today. So yeah, my name is Caterina. I'm head of climate policy at Green Alliance, and for those of you who haven't heard of Green Alliance, we are an independent think tank and charity focused on achieving ambitious leadership for the environment. And today I was asked to talk about the transition towards electric vehicles, which was one of the main points highlighted in the Prime Minister's 10-point plan. This is a very significant sort of area of action to reduce emissions from across the country, because it helps to tackle the largest emitting sector. So the transport sector is responsible for nearly a third of emissions, of UK emissions, and the sort of transition towards electric vehicles will play a very significant role in bringing those emissions down. So if we move on to the next slide, what the 10-point plan set out, it was to commit the UK government to ban the sale, previous slide, to ban the sale of new conventional petrol and diesel cars and vans from 2030, and to ban the sale of all new non-zero emission cars and vans from 2035. So after 2035, only zero emission vehicles will be sold as new vehicles. And this is a very significant step. It sets the direction of travel for the industry. And what is important is also that this is not necessarily just a far away sort of target, but what will need to happen is really for delivery and the transition to these new clean cars and vans to happen quickly. So the graph on the right-hand side is showing what the Climate Change Committee recommends in terms of the uptake of these vehicles. So the Climate Change Committee is the independent advisor on climate to the government, and they show that already by 2025, battery electric cars will have to represent nearly 50% of new car sales. So the shift really needs to happen quickly. And in that sense, it's positive that government has put forward some policies to deliver and sort of help the transition in the near term, but more is needed, and I can talk about that in a bit more detail later. But if we go on to the next slide, what does the transition to electric vehicles mean, and what needs to happen in practice? So this will have implications on a number of fronts. Apologies, previous slide again. It will have implications on a number of fronts, and I've grouped them broadly in three categories. So one is to do with the car itself. So it will require design, production, maintenance of these vehicles, and also the move to a circular economy. So we make better use of the materials sort of utilized for producing these vehicles. The second area is around charging infrastructure and the power sector that will be required to support the energy demand from electric vehicles. And the point is around integrating electric vehicles into the wider system and making sure that we move to a clean and modern transport system. So if we move on to the next slide, if we sort of dive into the design, production, maintenance of these vehicles, at the moment, electric vehicles, so there's still, in terms of models, car models that are available on the UK market, conventional petrol and diesel cars, there's still 7 times as many car models available on the market compared to battery electric cars, which are really the clean, the zero emission vehicle types that we want to see in the future. So going forward, it's a matter of sort of really designing and developing new models of electric vehicles, including new battery chemistries to make batteries more efficient and to reduce the amount of some of the critical materials that go into battery manufacturing. And it's also about scaling up production in the UK, because at the moment, obviously, not all UK car manufacturing, in fact, is focused on battery electric vehicles. In fact, it's a smaller percentage at the moment. But really, to future-proof the sector, the automotive industry will have to transition to battery electric vehicle production and to battery manufacturing. It also, and you might have heard, there were some sort of announcements recently with Stellantis committing to manufacture electric vans at its Ellesmere port, and also British Volt committing to producing batteries for cars in the UK, which are obviously very exciting developments. The other point, so on the other right-hand side of the slide, you see the fact that also better maintenance will be required to make sure that these vehicles can last for longer, both the vehicles and the battery. And that's, in terms of what it means in practice, job-wise, it will go from having sort of qualified technicians that can repair cars equipped with high voltage batteries, but also developing also new systems that relies, for example, on sensors and analytics that allow to monitor the performance and sort of enhance the maintenance of both vehicles and batteries. And for example, there's already industries and startups that are developing, for example, new analytic systems that allow to monitor how a battery is performing, and that allows not only to improve the performance of the battery while it's being used, but also to inform the design of new batteries so that they're learning, once they see the battery operating in the real world, how they can improve the future design. If we go on to the next slide, as I said, sort of the important aspect around production and of electric vehicles will also be around promoting a circular economy. We know that if we want to hit the net zero target, so decarbonize rapidly by the middle of the century, we need to also make better use of the resources that go into the vehicles, which means sort of designing vehicles so that they're lighter and therefore use less materials such as steel and aluminium, making sure that we are also reducing the waste during the production of those vehicles and increasing the refurbishment of those cars. And again, that will involve developing new processes, working with designers to make sure that we are optimizing the design of those cars, but also developing the business models to enable those cars to be brought back and remanufactured. And this applies to the car, but also to the battery. So it's making sure that the batteries are designed so that they can last longer, but they can also be disassembled and can be remanufactured. So you can make better use of the battery over its lifetime, as well as making it easier for the batteries to be recycled. And therefore, rather than having to always import cobalt and and some of the critical materials that go into the battery, the UK can create a more virtuous cycle also by recycling those materials and making sure that they don't go to waste, and instead they can be repurposed for battery production in the UK. And again, it will be important to work with across supply chains, so bringing together designers, manufacturers, sort of to develop these more designs that are sustainable and allow for this kind of more resource efficient use of the battery. It will be a matter of innovating on the business models to support, for example, leasing of batteries rather than sales, and also developing the infrastructure and the logistics to take the batteries back and make sure they can be reprocessed and re-enter the production line. If we move on to the next slide, so I'll talk briefly about the implication then for charging infrastructure and the power sector. So electric vehicles rely on having also access to the charging infrastructure. So we need to have charging points deployed across the country. At the moment, the map on the left-hand side is showing the extent to which charging points are being rolled out. And you see that the darkest spots show that there's quite a lot of charging infrastructure available, whereas some of the lighter areas show that there needs to be more deployed. And that will create jobs in installation, operation, and maintenance of those charging points. And on the other hand, as we transition to electric vehicles and as other parts of the economy also decarbonize, we will need to also expand the power sector to make sure that it can help meet the demand for electric vehicles and other uses of low carbon power. Then that would mean basically expanding the renewables, upgrading the network and grid infrastructure, but also developing the smart systems that can allow the grid to operate in a more flexible way, and that allow, for example, vehicles also to be charged in a smart way, so that they are not necessarily having to put more demand onto the network when it is already high demand, but they can instead be more flexible in the way that they charge and potentially feed power back into the grid. So all of these will be ways in which sort of the electric vehicles effectively will become another asset on the power sector and start to actually play a much more active role in enabling the system to become much more flexible. And then if we go on to the next slide, obviously we ideally would want to move to a system in which, like, we're not necessarily sort of crowding more and more cars onto the roads, but instead we can move to a system in which cars, first of all, are used much more intensely. At the moment, for example, a lot of them tend to be parked most of the time, so there's a lot of emissions that go wasted in producing cars that don't get really used. And on the other hand, obviously, making sure that people, as much as possible, can rely on public transport and other forms of travel, including sort of walking and cycling, if they can. So there's a whole area of innovation that is around, for example, promoting shared mobility, sort of models such as car clubs or lift share that allow for more intensive use of vehicles, making sure that we're expanding public transport and infrastructure for walking and cycling, so that people, they will be also incentivized not necessarily to own a car, to make more use of public transport, but then use, for example, join a car club if they need to drive at the weekend or for particular occasions. And that will obviously mean sort of expanding public transport, jobs in the creation of this public transport infrastructure, in the planning of local transport systems, as well as in developing sort of the data and sort of the apps that will allow for this seamless mobility. So making sure there's smart ticketing systems, making sure that there are trip planning softwares that allow for people to really make use of these different modes of transport from when they need to travel from A to B. And then finally, it's also to highlight that planning in itself plays a really vital role in enabling this kind of integrated low carbon transport. And there, it's really a matter of sort of making sure that as we are developing new areas of housing, for example, those are really developed around low carbon transport, and that they allow also for, in fact, shared mobility spaces. And again, urban planners and will play a vital role in making sure that that can happen. So to recap, I think it's an area which offers a lot of really exciting opportunities. It will sort of bring benefits in terms of jobs, in terms of cleaner air, and ideally by integrating it into this wider low carbon transport system, also helping to ease congestion and create more livable neighborhoods. But I think just to emphasize that again, policy will play a vital role in making that happen. And I think we are keen to see government really taking a leadership role in the years to come. And I'm happy to take questions now.
Thank you so much, Caterina. That was absolutely brilliant to hear from you. And I think this really reiterates a point that we made in our earlier session today, that clear top-down governmental policy is truly crucial for scaling up industry and encouraging markets and supply chain. So let me just pop into the Q&A and have a look what everyone has. So firstly, a question: do you think it is realistic that we could have a transport industry supporting both electric vehicles and hydrogen-powered vehicles, or would a single solution, for example, fully electric vehicle fleet, be a more efficient way of transitioning to a decarbonised transport?
Thanks. So from our perspective, electrification of transport will play a much more significant role, for sure, in the passenger transport, and potentially also for a really significant chunk of freight. Hydrogen, we see its role only for very sort of niche applications in the long haul freight, and potentially for shipping and aviation, but really not for passenger transport, not for cars and not for vans. Shall I answer the second question?
Yes, please. I was just had one up here for what are Green Alliance's main policy asks to government on electric vehicles, and what policies would you enact tomorrow if given that power?
Yeah, so there's a few policies that I'd cover. So in terms of driving adoption of electric vehicles in the near term, one of the things that we think would be a game changer is the introduction of a zero emission vehicles mandate. So this is a mandate that government would set on manufacturers, on car manufacturers, to sell a certain share of electric vehicles every year over the next, or setting sort of, for example, 3 yearly targets over the next decade. And that is really to make sure that manufacturers are incentivized to put more electric vehicles in the market. They're incentivized to develop more models. And that will, on the one hand, have to bring down costs because there will be obviously competition between manufacturers. But it would also ensure that manufacturers, if they're deciding what to invest in, they really do go for electric vehicles rather than investing in supply chains, for example, for hybrid vehicles. So setting a zero emission vehicles mandate is really the way to drive forward the transition. And it will also ensure that we are front loading the transition to electric vehicles, and therefore also more electric vehicles will enter the second-hand market sooner, which is where a lot of less affluent people will be able to access and benefit from clean cars.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that great answer. So I think we have time to squeeze in one more question. What sort of policies can encourage the use of public transport? Do you think there needs to be more communication surrounding the uptake of public transport and electric vehicles?
So in terms of promoting public transport, I think there's a few points. I think greater investment in public transport will play a vital role. So seeing a scale up in investment for particularly for buses and for decarbonization of buses, but it's also much of greater investment in infrastructure for walking and cycling. In parallel, I think it's really a matter of sort of designing so that the planning system will also play an important role in making sure that new developments are not locking in car dependency. There are unfortunately various examples of developments over the past years that were completely dependent on car use. So there was no public transport connection, no cycle lanes for people to use. So making sure that as the government now is planning to reform the planning system, it embeds low carbon transport as part of it will be very important. And then the final point I'll make is also that government needs to have, I think, start a conversation around how can we make public transport sort of more affordable and make sure that everyone can benefit from it, and that there is really an incentive also sort of from a financial point of view for people to use public transport, because ultimately that would be the way in which they can, it becomes a more affordable form of transport.
Great, thank you. I think that was a great question. It's really, interesting to hear how the differences we can make in our everyday life that kind of work and align with some of the emerging technologies that we are seeing emerging in our race to decarbonisation. So we will now be moving on to our next speaker. I would also like to say in the Q&A, you can kind of like the question, and this will make the questions kind of raise to the top. So this way we can kind of prioritize questions and make sure that we're answering the ones that are really of interest to you all, as this session is all for you guys. So we'd like, moving on to Rishi, please, the Head of Climate and Sustainable Finance at Natwest.
Cheers, Jules, and thank you to RenewableUK and the Futures Forum for having me here today. I'm over the next couple of minutes, 15 minutes, I want to share a little bit about my career journey to date, what green finance means and climate finance means. It's a rapidly evolving and nascent space, ways you might be able to get involved, and how this ties into the 10-point plan, because actually government policy underpins a lot of this, because we're only able to finance what the real economy is doing. So by way of brief intro, I've been at NatWest Group now for 17 years, started on the bond desk, did equity investments in renewables and helped build up our leading project finance business, which is where I first got involved investing and financing renewables. So for my early part of my mid part of my career, I financed 500 megawatts of renewables around the UK, wind, solar and biomass. the last 6-7 years, I've been focused on climate strategy. And some of you may be wondering, what's a bank got to do with climate? What's a bank's relevance to this? And hopefully over the next 15 minutes, I'll give you a bit of a flavour. Climate for me is very much personally part of my purpose. When I was, like you folks, sat in my seat at university, I wanted to do something that could make an impact. And this is something I sought out. So when I was applying for jobs, I looked at who was top of the then FT's sustainability league tables, and made my decisions along that way. And some less thoughtful decisions, like I didn't want to work at Canary Wharf and I wanted to work in the city, but that's by the by. Outside the bank, I serve on the board of RenewableUK, which is I'm delighted to do so, and on UCSIF, the UK Sustainable Investment Finance Association. And also for my strange hobbies, I chair Camden's local government pension scheme, which is a just over £2 billion asset ESG, that's environmental, social and governance aligned fund, where we've aligned to the Sustainable Development Goals. So if we can hit the next slide. So last February, our CEO, our new CEO, we are quite unusual, sadly, to this day. Still, very few companies have a female CEO and CFO, it's Chief Financial Officer and Chief Executive Officer. But Alison coming in brought in our new purpose-led strategy. That new purpose is champion potential, helping people, family, and businesses to thrive. As part of that new purpose-led strategy, we set out 3 initial areas of focus that we thought we needed to and could make the biggest impact on. First of them, as Britain's biggest business bank enterprise, supporting new startups through multiple schemes, whether we've got our accelerator hubs to help people start startups and trying to unlock some of the barriers for women and ethnic minorities in starting up businesses. Secondly, learning, which is about building financial capability. We have our award-winning schools program, helping young people improve their awareness and knowledge around financial capability. We also have a video game, Island Saver, that's imminently playable and also has some climate aspects that's about saving the planet. And then the one that my area of focus, which is the climate space. And our CEO set an ambition to be a leading bank in the climate space. So I can hit the next slide, please. Now, I can understand why people might not think, what's climate got to the bank? So for us, that involves 4 aspects. Firstly, what the financing we already do and how do we reduce the impact of that? So we set ourselves a goal to halve the climate impact of our financing ambition activity by 2030. What does that mean in reality? That means mapping and tracking the emissions from the financing we provide, that's to companies and to individuals like yourselves and your families, and mapping sector trajectory paths of how to reduce that climate impact. So that's been a huge project because historically companies do not, and individuals, it's not easy to map people's emissions. We also needed to do that. To do that, we needed to restrict our most harmful emissions. So we set out a plan to phase out coal, and also require any oil and gas lending that we had, and we are one of the smallest, have the lowest exposure to the oil and gas sector across the UK main banks. That we wanted to require the oil and gas majors to have credible transition plans. And again, this involved third parties really digging into making sure that what they were saying and what people were committing to on transition paths were robust. And I think this is really important as a foundation layer. But the bit where I think, and this is where this ties best to the 10-point plan, is the role we can play in championing climate solutions and accelerating the speed of transition. As a large UK bank, we have a role in helping individuals, helping small businesses, mid-sized businesses and large businesses. And across each of those streams, we have looked at what can we do. So earlier this week, we announced that we'll be launching a part of our banking app. We'll have a partnership with Kogo, which will help individuals and users track their emissions, so that people like ourselves can actually track what we're doing from what we're spending and take action on reducing those. We launched a green mortgage product, and we've launched a green hub to help people identify green mortgage to help incentivize people to increase the energy efficiency of their buildings and improve the EPC ratings. which comes to, hopefully, unfortunately, the government seems to have delayed out the green warm homes and clean buildings and warm homes paper this morning. But we know that there's a big policy gap at the moment since the 10-point plan. The second part around this is supporting businesses, and this involves helping startups, helping businesses understand what their emissions are. And with that, we have a pilot that we're running with Microsoft at the moment to help small businesses map and understand their emissions and take action and set themselves targets. And we'll have more news and information about that closer to COP with a fair wind. We also are one of the largest financiers of these projects. So that's where my team came from. So we are the largest lender to the UK renewable sector. And that involves a range of jobs and skills, such as project finance itself. In my old product space, you would work with engineers, you work with lawyers, you work with credit colleagues to really understand how you structure a transaction. So when we're financing something like a Dogger Bank, which we help finance, or any of the 2 billion we lent to renewables last year, this involves a range of skills and talents. So for those of you in the audience, whatever your degree is, there is a role in climate for you in some shape or form. Final piece is around our green, social and sustainable bond framework. So this is for the largest companies really, but the bond markets, capital markets, are where big companies, largest companies can access capital. We issued our first green bond earlier this year, and this enables us to access, and at the moment it brings in investors who want to have access to exposure to green ESG related assets. Since then, in the last sort of 2-3 years, we have led 36 green bond issuances, raising £23 billion for a range of customers, and we're the largest leading UK bank in this space in sterling issuance. Then finally, on entrepreneurs, we've reserved 25% spaces in our UK entrepreneurial accelerators. So we have colleagues who support entrepreneurs starting up. The third box there is about being climate positive. So to be able to do this properly, we have people in our workplaces who are constantly looking at improving the energy efficiency of our workplaces. We were the first group alongside Landsec to sign up for the Climate Group's 3 headline initiatives: RE100, so 100% renewable powered in the UK; EV100, where we're installing charging infrastructure across our work sites, but also switching any residual fleet. We're not a big fleet operator, to be honest, but making sure that any fleet we do have is electric, and then improving our energy productivity, which is our energy efficiency, where we set ourselves some strong targets in there. We set ourselves a target to be climate positive by 2025, and through the use of some offsets, we've been net zero on our own operations this year. But we realised this works by building, can only work by building powerful partnerships. So whether it's the Microsoft partnership or the one we have with Octopus Energy to enable anyone to install charging infrastructure, there's a lot more we need to do to help connect up business, to help connect up how our customers can transition in this space. Furthermore, we announced last year that we're one of the headline sponsors of COP, and for us, this provides a huge opportunity to really get engaged with that public policy debate. Things like the 10-point plan are so absolutely critical in this. You need for us to be able to finance the transition, we need the government policy to be there in place to enable our customers to be following that, whether that's offshore wind, which is a critical sector, whether it's, as Caterina spoke about, the EV transition, which we see growing and growing, but only yesterday did we get the sort of transport decarbonisation plan that hopefully sets a bit more detail and a bit more colour. So policy is deeply important in this, and we are policy takers generally, but we do have a role also where we are large lenders, for example, in the mortgage book, where nearly 50%, or about 40%, sorry, at the last TCFD, our last disclosure of our emissions sit. So we have a role to make sure that we are helping our customers make those transitions, because it's not straightforward. If it was easy, we'd be doing it now. And being set that ambition at a top level by our CEO really helps us. We're very conscious this is not easy, and there's a range of skills required. So when I look across the franchising functions I work with across the bank, I have my retail banking colleagues who are experts at dealing, from our branch colleagues to people who work in the investment bank. We have a full range of skills, and actually over the last 3-4 years, we've been building what I call my carbon army within the bank. So I've got 2,000 people who are part of our Sustainable Futures Network, many of them young people like yourselves, a lot of graduates and people coming straight in who really want to make an impact and have purpose in their jobs. We've also taken 1,200 of our senior leaders through climate education programs, whether that's Cambridge Institute of Sustainable Leadership programs or the University of Edinburgh, who we've partnered with, which also means that we've got the generals as well to help support the carbon army. But I think the way finance is transformed has been driven by, I guess, 2-3 main factors. To sum up, first one of those is regulation. So we've seen the Bank of England, and I often joke that Mark Carney is my pin-up boy alongside Jamie Vardy on my wall, because he helped transform the requirements on banks and the financial service sector. So because it's no good me just getting Natwest to decarbonise our balance sheet or provide products. I need all the banking sector and financial service sector in the UK and world to be doing that, which is a lofty ambition, but that can come through regulation and through challenge. We've recently partaken in the climate stress tests, which test the resilience of the financial service sector to climate shocks. And I think this will help continue to drive that activity and keep it on the top of financial institutions' agendas. The second piece is a growth from investors, and that's that interest in ESG, environmental, social, and governance issues. And I think this is a real key driver. So the money that you and I will save when we work and in our pensions and our lifetime savings, we have a choice about where we put that money and how that money is saved, because it's our long-term savings pots for when we retire. Now, and I appreciate you're at the beginning of your career, so it's hard to get people to think about this, but actually there are increasing investors who want to have more ESG and more impact with their money. We want to know that our pensions are doing good and making sure the planet will be in a state that we can live in and our future generations of children can live in. So financial services are absolutely a key lubricant to achieving our climate goals. We need finance to help achieve these goals, and if we can put finance to good purpose, this can really help us achieve those goals. So just to wrap up on, I think, on just to link back to the 10-point plan fully, I think there's a lot in there, especially around offshore wind. The deployment of that has been immense. I think the pace on hydrogen, we need more clarity on government policies, and there's a long-term policy framework, because we can't. It's harder for business to invest, and then even harder for us to lend, because banks' risk appetites are normally around more certain cash flows. I think some of the bits are more speculative, but you do need thinking around what that future policy landscape will look like, and especially around the broader transport trends. But I think I'll wrap up there. I just end with saying there are so many good jobs now in finance that you'll see this continue to grow, that climate knowledge, awareness of the science and technology behind this. I've had to go back and do further studies after my economics degree originally to actually really understand what science means, what does adaptation mean, what can we do in the future. And my role now is just to help understand those trends and try and put them into practice. So I think that's my 15 minutes up, Jules. So let's throw open to the questions. Oh, yeah, some further reading here if anyone likes. Our purpose is on the website. The TCFD, as always in climate, we have too many jargons, but it's the Task Force on Climate Related Financial Disclosures. Ours is a 60-odd page report, but it's worth a skim to get a sense of how much information we're required and want to disclose. And then the final one is our 20 billion funding and financing target that we've got for ourselves to finish this year. And that's trying to show some more transparency in how we disclose that.
Thanks, Rishi. That was excellent. I think certainly in my case, looking at the 10-point plan and seeing point 10 as green finance and innovation, that one point has always, I've never really fully understood exactly how crucial mobilising finance is towards decarbonisation. So that was really, really useful to hear, particularly again, going back to how we can help as individuals, and looking a little bit more into your pension scheme and where your finances are being invested. As I know actually in the big picture, this makes an enormous difference, and is really crucial in kind of creating a new narrative and shifting in paradigms. So that's wonderful, thanks. So I'll pop into the questions now. I know you touched upon it briefly, but just if you could give a little bit information on how the attendees here could go about working in sustainable finance. Are there any key specific roles to apply for? And if so, what level would you expect to apply for them?
Brilliant. So, I mean, many banks now have graduate and internship schemes. I started as an intern in 2004, which don't do the maths because it tells you how old I am. But you won't, and you might not necessarily find that perfect climate role. And this is why we've helped create our Sustainable Futures Network. The key thing I keep pointing out is that, so I have a small team of about 4 or 5 people who run in the Climate Centre of Excellence in Natwest. Apologies, the joys of working from home. But actually, for me, success looks like embedding climate knowledge throughout our business. So if you want to work in climate, that doesn't mean you have to work in a climate centre. It's actually, there are multiple roles to help transform the business. So when I look at that across our legal functions, across our business lending functions, actually to really change the bank and financial reporting, there are all sorts of different ways, depending on your skill sets and what your degree is. There are lots and lots of options. And often what I challenge people back to is not to say, oh, what's the perfect climate job? But how can I bring climate to make an impact in the job I do?
Great, thank you. I'm sure that was really helpful to the attendees who are probably looking out for potential jobs. Another question here, does NatWest have a goal to fully stop investing in oil and gas in the long term?
Yeah, so we there are sort of 2 things we set out. Firstly, we've been reducing and putting increased restrictions. Things like shale gas, and we put increasing restrictions on, and we've been slowly tilting that book. We have one of the smallest exposures. About 0.8% of our book is exposed to the oil and gas sector. The point I just make on this is that we've got to also do this in a just, bringing in the context of a just transition. So a lot of the jobs around Aberdeen, for example, which is a city in Scotland, are around the oil and gas sector. And if we were to pull out tomorrow, we would risk a very disorderly transition in those. Now, we absolutely need to reduce the world economy's reliance on oil and gas. Absolutely, there's no doubts about that. But what we need to do is make sure we have the most orderly transition, because actually we want those oil and gas engineers, some of those, to retrain as offshore wind operators. We want some of those to operate the jack-up barges. We want some of those, that technical expertise to go there, because we learned from the horrors of coal mine closures. If you don't think about transition and a just transition, which is about fairness and thinking about the impact of this, you can end up leaving communities stranded. So yes, in the medium term, you do want to. We need to wean the world's economy. There's not even a question about that off oil and gas. But we also need to do that in a fair way so that workers don't get left behind.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I know there's a lot of conversations about security of supply and just transition. So this is definitely something to bear in mind as we are in such a pivotal moment towards decarbonisation. So I'll just check the time. I think we have maybe time just for one last quick one. Would applicants need to have a background in finance, business or economics in order to apply and succeed in some of these jobs?
So I'm glad to say no. And I think this is really important, because actually when we think more and more about climate, I'm an economist by training, but by background, but we don't need just economists or accountants or finance backgrounds. We need to bring in different skills, because actually you have a real range, even within a bank, you have such a range of employees, from people who are on risk, people who are involved in legal, people who are involved in frontline, doing our own operations for our own building sites. So there's a real range of jobs. And what I challenge and what I encourage people to do is think about, again, what is it they want to do, and how can they then have that impact with in their roles in climate? Because that's how that's honestly how I started. I wanted to bring 4 or 5 years. I was doing mergers and acquisitions out in Frankfurt. It was a tough time working all hours, more hours in the day than seemed to exist logically. And it's like I had a realization I wanted to do something that could add purpose. And I think across the bank's roles and across the skills and across industry, actually, it's not just, I don't just want you to work in banking, but actually in any business, we need to, if we're going to have a whole sector and a whole economy transition, we need to be bringing bright young people like yourselves into bringing this climate agenda and thinking around what does that mean for each business. Each business model will be different. It will not be straightforward for everyone. And we need bright brains like yourselves and that passion and ambition to do that.
Thanks, Rishi. Yeah, I think passion is very important. Just like to reiterate that. I think a lot of people kind of go into this industry wanting to make a difference, and that's a big driver. Great, so thank you for that. That was really informative and yeah, incredibly interesting. So that takes us on to our final speaker. We'll be hearing from Alicia Green, who's the program manager at OIC. And yeah, this will be really incredibly interesting, particularly as a lot of us are aware that some of the ambition for offshore wind is huge, with a 40 gigawatt target by 2030. So this will be really interesting to hear about the delivery of that. Thanks, Alicia.
Brilliant. Thanks, Jules. So hi, everyone. Great to be speaking to you today. As Jules said, I'm Alicia, and I'll be providing you with a quick whistle-stop tour of the offshore wind sector in the UK, but also what this means in terms of opportunities for you in the lead up to net zero. So firstly, I have worked in the offshore wind sector since the start of my career. But I think what is notable to point out is that my roles have already been really, really varied. So everything from events planning to renewable policy, and now as a project manager. So I currently work for the Offshore Wind Industry Council, primarily focused on helping deliver the UK's ambitious targets for offshore wind out to 2030. But first, you're probably wondering what is the Offshore Wind Industry Council, so I'll touch on this first. If we could just go on to the next slide. Brilliant. So OIC is a senior government and industry forum, and we're comprised of members drawn from the leading UK and global firms in offshore wind. So this is everything from developers to original equipment manufacturers working in the supply chain. And we partner closely with the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy within government, that being our touch point there. So day to day, I personally work with a multitude of different companies, different stakeholders, and even within these organisations work with a whole breadth of people in very, very different roles. So I'm hoping I can give you an insight into how our industry really does have a role for everyone, particularly given the number of new and different skills we're going to need to rapidly grow the sector. Next slide, please. So first, what does offshore wind have to offer, and why does offshore wind matter in the context of the 10-point plan? Well, first of all, it's no surprise that offshore wind is the first pillar of the government plan, and that's given that currently the UK is the world leader in offshore wind. It's actually the UK's 4th largest infrastructure project. So, you know, for the UK, offshore wind is a massive, massive success story. In the UK, the power sector has actually managed to reduce its CO2 emissions faster than any other sector in our economy. And so as we move out to net zero by 2050, offshore wind is really going to be critical in meeting this commitment. I quite like to try and paint offshore wind in a picture that kind of everyone can digest. So I sometimes see that perhaps the size of the industry isn't so apparent to everyone. So first of all, to put in context, if we take figures from last year, wind power in the UK accounted for 20% of our power supply. And the growth now is set to be rapid. So we have around 10 gigawatts of offshore wind projects installed today, but by 2025, so only 4 years from now, we'll have over 20 gigawatts of offshore wind operational in UK waters. So that's twice the capacity we have now. So hopefully that paints a picture of quite how fast we're moving. And in addition to the government's ambition that Jules pointed out, 40 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030, we also have commitment of 1 gigawatt of floating offshore wind. So that's a newer technology, which means that the turbines don't have to be fixed to the seabed, and we can deploy turbines further out at sea in deeper waters. And also government commitment of £160 million investment in UK ports to allow for this continued growth. Next slide, please. Now, I continue to find the offshore wind sector absolutely fascinating. The moment for me, I think, where I really was in awe of what our industry has achieved so far in terms of innovation, in terms of construction and infrastructure, in terms of decarbonisation, was actually when I stood under an offshore wind turbine for the first time. I mean, these pieces of kit are absolutely huge, and they're also a fantastic example of craftsmanship and UK kind of innovation. Now, unfortunately, I can't take all of you today and place you under a turbine, but hopefully I can kind of reel out a few facts and figures to help put into perspective what we're really talking about when we tell the story of offshore wind in the UK. So first of all, our total capacity of both offshore and onshore wind in the UK currently generates enough electricity to meet the annual needs of over 18 million homes. So that's a reduction in CO2 emissions of over 29 million tonnes a year. If we zoom in then to wind farms specifically, so individual wind farms, if we look at Hornsea 1, for example, which currently is the world's largest wind farm located in the UK, that wind farm alone covers an area of 407 kilometres squared. So that's roughly 5 times the size of Hull, and that's just one wind farm. And the same wind farm, so Hornsea 1, generates enough power to power 1 million UK homes. And if we kind of do a quick sort of forward look, another wind farm already set to be built, the Dogger Bank wind farm, which Rishi actually mentioned. This isn't in the water yet, but once operational, this will take over as the world's largest wind farm. And this wind farm alone will power 6 million homes, which is really quite vast. If we go one step further and zoom in to the turbines themselves, the innovation here is really driving change. And beyond the image on the screen, which demonstrates that turbines today are approaching roughly the height of the Shard in London. So you can understand why I was quite taken aback when I stood under one. But one fact that I think really helps illustrate the changing pace of technology is that for a 7 megawatt turbine, which is quite common for wind farms already operating today. So a number of the turbines that you can see off the coast that have been generating power for a number of years. One rotation of that turbine, so the blades going around once on a 7 megawatt turbine, powers a UK home for a day, which I think is just incredible. However, if you think that's cool, GE have recently launched its Haliade X turbine, which at 13 megawatts can power a home for 2 days from one rotation. And these 13 megawatt turbines are also a lot taller as well. So the Haliade X is 260 meters tall, compared to 190 meters for the 7 megawatt turbines. And kind of another measurement, each blade of the 13 megawatt model measures 107 meters. So again, to put that in context, each blade is therefore roughly twice the wingspan of the Angel of the North. So these pieces of kit are huge. When it comes to a career in offshore wind though, there's more to simply building a turbine or a wind farm. In fact, there are opportunities requiring very, very different skill sets, all the way from the initial sort of concept and design phases of a wind farm. Where are we going to build it? What's it going to look like? How many turbines are there going to be? How big are the turbines going to be? Through the building stages, how do we get it in the water? How do we go through the consenting process, the legal side, the planning side, etc., all the way through to operations. So once we're up and running, how do we maintain the wind farm? How do we service the wind farm? And then looking even further afield, the future of repowering and decommissioning, and the kind of workforce that will need to deliver that as well. If we go on to the next slide. So a bit more on the job side of things. OIC recently published some research actually highlighting quite how quickly opportunities to work in the offshore wind sector are going to grow. So we're looking to employ over 69,800 people by 2026, and that's up from 26,000 people in the workforce today. So really, really scaling up now. The majorities of these jobs will be created in parts of the UK which are part of the government's levelling up agenda. So going back to what Rishi said about just transition, this is again another great success story for the UK. So looking to increase the number of jobs in the northeast of England, Yorkshire and the Humber, East Anglia and Scotland, but also, noting that jobs aren't exclusive to these areas. I have a London-based job, many colleagues all over the country, and also we can't forget that although the UK is a leader in offshore wind, we're part of a global sector and a rapidly growing offshore wind sector globally. So lots of opportunities as well there in terms of lessons learned from the UK and how we can help other countries, but also a number of companies working internationally anyway. And the wide range of jobs I don't think is always particularly clear. So we have everything from engineers, project managers, software designers, turbine technicians, deep sea divers, helicopter pilots, boat crews, all the way through to your more kind of conventional office-based roles, such as mine, such as those in public relations, strategy and sales, recruitment, policy. I mean, the list really does go on and on. I can't speak to every role, but I can quickly talk about my story. So I entered the industry on an internship, and then I worked my way through predominantly project management and policy focused roles before landing in my current role. But what I've really enjoyed is that during this time, although I've always been focused on offshore wind, I've been involved with very different aspects of it. So for instance, I spent some time working on the health and safety of turbine workers, then worked on setting targets with UK government on what the future workforce should look like in terms of diversity. Worked in collaboration with the Ministry of Defence and Department for Transport, ensuring that turbines don't cause conflict with military and civil aviation radar systems, which is a very, very niche topic, as well as working more broadly with a number of key environmental stakeholders and NGOs, the likes of the RSPB and Natural England, to better understand how we balance the growth of our industry with crucial protection of the marine environment. So in short, there's lots to do in our sector, not only because we're growing fast, but because there are a lot of different companies and opportunities once you're working for us. And I think what's important, and something that I wish I'd been told at university, is find a sector you love, find values you love and run with that. It's not, unless you're going into a very technical role, and then I would advise that you kind of do that properly. But unless, if you're thinking more broadly of the bigger picture, and I want to work in a particular sector, or I want to work in sustainability, do note that once you're working there, you can move around. It's not as if you have to choose a role and stick for that for the rest of your career. That's just the first step. And for me, the ability to move around and do different things, but have that kind of crucial link between them all, has been what I have enjoyed the most. I appreciate this has been a very quick canter through offshore wind in the UK, but hopefully has given you a quick taste of what's on offer and what the sector actually looks like. And yes, thank you for having me speak today, and I am happy to take any questions.
Thanks very much, Alicia. Yeah, I can't reiterate the point enough that this is just such a fast-moving space, and the immense amount of stakeholders involved in offshore wind and the delivery of these projects is just huge. So, although yeah, that was a great presentation, but it really does just the tip of the iceberg with how great this industry is. So I've got a couple of questions here. What is being done to ensure that marine biodiversity is not damaged by such massive offshore turbines?
So this is a big topic, and the short answer is lots is being done. So I think, I think there's two parts to this question. So what is offshore wind doing to mitigate damage, and then what does offshore wind provide? So I think one of the things that perhaps isn't seen as clearly as offshore wind turbines in particular can actually house mini kind of ecosystems once in the sea. Particularly the monopiles can create sort of artificial reefs and feeding grounds for particular species. So there's a lot of work going on around that and making sure the right materials are used and things to kind of maximise on that marine biodiversity. But in terms of kind of the mitigation point, historically we've worked on a kind of project by project basis. So every wind farm has to go through a very rigorous consenting process, which involves a number of different environmental impact assessments, all under the EU Habitats Regulation Assessment, very stringent, and working with a number of key environmental stakeholders to evidence what the damage may be. And then what happens is that's mitigated against. So, for instance, one of the classic ones previously has been potential noise from piling and construction on harbour porpoise or dolphins, and things done around that is technology has been developed, things like bubble curtains, where you can kind of isolate a part of the sea and protect the marine biodiversity whilst you're constructing. But kind of now that the ramp up is so vast, and it's on a kind of resource basis in terms of going through the planning system and being able to mitigate project by project, a lot more is being done to kind of look at this more strategically. So we have strategic marine plans, and we're trying to pull multiple projects together to see what we can do together to not just mitigate any potential damage from the marine environment, but actually restore the marine environment and provide what's termed as net gain. So kind of leave the marine environment in a better state than we found it. So there's lots of talk around kind of cumulative funds and projects being pulled together to deliver that sort of things, either for entire ecosystems or specific species. So for instance, kittiwake birds being one, building towers and nesting sites and things where any displacement there can be managed and actually provide them with a better part of the environment to breed and live in. But great question.
Great.
There's a lot more on that.
Great answer as well. Thanks for answering that so thoroughly, Alyssia. I'm sure it will give a lot of people really great to hear that the industry really are doing their bit, and not just that, but really proactively getting involved in kind of leaving the environment in a nice, diverse and healthy state. So we'll wrap up here. That's the end of the session. I'd like to thank all of our wonderful speakers for sharing their expertise. Hope that's really helped you see the diverse, the diverse kind of jobs out there. There really is so much work to be done and so much on offer.